just absolutely amazing. And what's happening now with these changes that I mentioned is that we're literally having a tidal wave of these people who've had these empathic death experiences. As a matter of fact, about 5 years almost ago, 4.5 years ago, I was out here with the Bigelows, and we were talking about this phenomenon, and we had a meeting to discuss possible ways of looking into this, and it was on Mother's Day, I remember, in 1994, and the Bigelows took us to a shopping mall after this meeting on Sunday, and I called my mother and said, you know, wish her happy Mother's Day. And I said, well, how are you doing? And she said, oh, I feel great. And she was insisting that she felt wonderful, but that the day before she had broken out in a rash all over her body, and they took her to the doctor, and the doctor looked her over and said, well, I don't think this is anything to worry about, but just come in Monday, which was the next day. And she felt completely optimistic this would be nothing. Well, she went in the next day, and the doctor examined her and said, well, you have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and you have 2 days to 2 weeks to live. And so Cheryl and I went to her bedside, and we were there with her this whole 2 weeks. And indeed, 2 weeks to the day, she did pass away. 2 days before she actually died, she had become so obtunded that we thought that she would never revive at all, and she just totally lost consciousness. But the moment she died, her eyes popped open and she looked at us all, and very coherently she said twice, I love you, and then she passed away. And it was so fascinating because at that point I myself had this experience, I didn't have this out-of-body experience or whatever, but definitely an experience that I couldn't put into words for you, but it was very touching to me. And so did Cheryl, my wife, and so did my 2 sisters. I should explain to your folks that I am the only person in my family who's ever had any interest in any sort of unusual topic like this. My dad was a surgeon, and also he had almost become a professional military officer. So you can imagine how my family responded when I got interested in this sort of thing. So this family was antithetical to this kind of thing, but it's interesting that my sister, who's a pharmacist at that point, said that she felt this presence of my father, who had died 18 months before. And we all had a conversation about this, and agreed that we had extraordinary states of consciousness at that point. And so, since what primarily motivates me in life to do anything is curiosity, at that point I sort of, as you can imagine, my energy to do that particular kind of study kind of trickled out because I had it firsthand, and that put it in a whole different light. But I think this is something that bears investigating, and no doubt is making a very powerful impact on a lot of people. And to show this, I would ask you just to be upfront and open about this, if you don't mind. I know it's a very personal thing, but how many of you here know from your own personal experience what I'm talking about with this? And if you could just hold your hands up for a minute and look around the room. Well, here in this room we have a number of people, maybe a dozen or so, who have had this experience firsthand that I'm talking about. And if you multiply that by a whole country full of people, we are having a major phenomenon here. Incidentally, as a psychiatrist, I find it very interesting that this is somewhat similar, I think, in my mind anyway, it relates to a fascinating phenomenon called the couvade. And that is that it's fairly common at the birth of a child for the bystanders, usually the husband, but also other relatives and people present, to have the symptoms of the birth process. We mostly know the couvade in terms of the morning sickness, that the father gets morning sickness during the pregnancy. But also this has many other manifestations, including phenomena like labor contractions that will take place as the mother goes into labor. The father too will have contractions. And I think it's interesting that these empathic phenomena exist on both ends of the life cycle. I do want to get to your questions here. I want to also bring up one other interesting phenomenon related to death and dying that these changes in our society are bringing about. And what I see happening is that our great-grandparents knew about these things very well. But what happened is that when we started dying in hospitals, I guess in the 20s or 30s, a whole generation or two really lost touch with these unusual psychological or spiritual phenomena that take place around the time of death. And one that I've been really interested in for the past few years is called Fey, F-E-Y. That's an old word that's been in the language for a long time. But back in the 20s or 30s, I suppose, gradually began to be assumed to be something that was just a fiction. But now we're seeing this all the time with patients, and that is that as people go through the dying process and they're gradually getting more obtunded and unresponsive, and everybody decides, well, we'll never get Uncle Willard back again or whatever, that just prior to the death, they do a dramatic turnaround. And I see a number of you who've been through this. And they suddenly will become, as it's often described, more alert, more vibrantly alive than they have ever been. And people often in this situation will say, as a man from Australia a couple of years ago, remember the look on his face when he told me about this, he was describing how his wife had been ill for years, but then the day that she died, she did this dramatic turnaround, and he said he had never seen her looking so vibrant and healthy. And he said, I almost had the feeling that she already had one foot on the other side. And by that I mean that it strikes people who witness this as almost preternatural, if not supernatural. A man that I can talk about he was dying of kidney failure, had been unconscious for several days, and everybody had assumed he would not ever regain consciousness. And suddenly he just sat up in the bed and with great dignity called all of his immediate nuclear family members around and gave, and this big extended family gave a specific message, named everybody in the extended family, gave this message, sort of said his goodbyes, and then just turned over and died. And again, you see this, it's really quite fascinating. Out of this, I feel, is coming a resurgence of the phenomenon which I am labeling the swan song phenomenon, because the first document that I know of, anyway, in the Western tradition that has to do with the notion of life after death is the Phaedo, a dialogue of Plato. And Plato is describing the death of his friend Socrates, who was a philosopher. And as Socrates is dying, the day before, he starts writing songs. And his friends ask him about this, and they said, well, why are you doing this, Socrates? Suddenly you're at the close of your life taking up songwriting. And he explained that he had been having these dreams from the muses encouraging him to make music. So he wrote these verses, and he compared it to the swan of the song, the song of the swans, who, as they are dying, apparently make the most beautiful songs that they have ever made, at least according to the legends. And I suspect, I feel confident enough to make a semi-prediction on this. I think that's probably a lot more common than we realize. I found an old book from 1834 with a fascinating series of cases of this. And as I've talked about this to hospice workers and so on, I've had a number of hospice workers said that they observed this, that just before someone died, they would break out into poetic expression. Even people who had never had any interest in poetry or never written poetry will suddenly compose verses. I kind of suspect what's going on there is that if you have a very powerful experience that you want very much to express, and there are no literal words available, then a logical outcome of that might be poetic expression, so that makes a certain amount of sense. Something I'm interested in following up on. I want to go on now to say a little bit about I want to open to your questions and comments very soon, but to talk a little bit about the the consciousness studies program and what we're going to be doing this year, because I would like to recruit those of you who would be interested to come to some of our programs. I want to reemphasize what I said at the beginning, that I think is very irresponsible when you hear these people making claims that are, unconsidered claims that this stuff is scientific evidence, that we live after we die. I mean, there are enormous complications about this. But nonetheless, I think that a rational approach is possible, not geared to proving there's a life after death, which I don't feel is plausible within the canons of logic and reason as we know it in the West. But nonetheless, I think it's entirely conceivable to look at this in the way that this fits into the Western tradition as a whole. There's a lot of fascinating stuff about this, which is well within the parameters of academic inquiry to look into. One that I could say very briefly, which is just absolutely fascinating to me. As we sit here in this room and we think about the notion of truth, which is much in the news these days, we assume quite naturally that we're dealing with a conception that goes back 30,000 years. I mean, if you just think about it abstractly, you would think, well, surely there's always been a notion of truth. I mean, that people even in Paleolithic times had the idea of truth. But one of the most fascinating stories of Western philosophy to me is that that's just not true at all. And that the Western notion of truth has a very precise origin, and with a specific man whose name was Parmenides, and who lived, born, as I recall, about 510 BC. He was before the foundation of academe by Plato by about 100 or so years, a little over 100 years. But it was Parmenides who invented the notion of truth. And I remember that when we learned about him when I was an undergraduate and as a graduate student, they told us when we were learning about this figure that from the writings that we have of him, we could tell that he had some sort of mystical experience. But beyond that, it wasn't really clear. But with the increased interest by scholars in religious studies and other fields now in this kind of altered state of awareness that is related to death, we've come to realize that very likely the experience that Parmenides had was something akin to either a near-death experience or an underworld journey or otherworld journey, as the ancient Greeks called them. And it might be surprising, but nonetheless true, that in ancient Greece, near-death experiences were dinner table conversation, just as they are in the United States today. That seems surprising, but they were very aware of phenomena like these. And also, they had various techniques of inducing or precipitating these visionary experiences, which they did at various facilities that they had set up to accomplish this. And apparently, the experience that Parmenides had was somehow related to death. It might have been a near-death experience or an otherworld journey.